CultivatED Marketer, Episode 23, Katie Macaulay, Internal or Employee Communications, Part 2. Want to know what it takes to have a productive career in internal or employee communications? Check out Part 2 of our conversation with Katie Macaulay, employee communications guru, host of the Internal Comms podcast, and international executive board member for IABC. Welcome to CultivatED Marketer, where we talk marketing professional development so your garden of opportunity grows. This is Brent Bowen.
And I'm Matt Tidwell.
And today we've got part 2 of our conversation with Katie Macaulay. Folks may remember that Katie is a leading voice in employee or internal communications. She's the managing director of AB, an agency designed to help organizations reach their full potential by creating informed, engaged, and connected employees. She's also the host of the Internal Comms podcast and is a member of the International Executive Board for IABC, which I believe that's how you know her.
It is.
Yeah, and in our first episode, we talked with Katie a little bit about her career journey, the state of employee and internal communications. And I believe what we have coming up here is, pressing challenges for employee and internal communications in part 2, post-pandemic and kind of otherwise. And then a little focus and conversation about the podcast.
Yeah, really excited for this next part of the conversation because we knew pre-pandemic that this is not your father's Oldsmobile with internal communications. Post-pandemic, that's absolutely the case, right? Because now we've changed the game in employee relations in many other different ways, including certainly remote learning. And gosh, how many big companies do we know that are still struggling with how to do that appropriately? And so to say that Katie's onto something with her topic, is it any wonder she's getting the audience that she's getting on that podcast? Because it really is a brand new day in so many ways. And gosh, I think back, Brent, when I broke into the business and internal communications, let's send out a few newsletters and we'll write the CEO's message and we'll call it good. That ain't going to cut it these days. Employees are empowered, much more so than they were in the past. And also, of course, they're portable. They've got the ability to pick up and leave whenever they want. So I just think, and you brought that out a little bit in the first part of the conversation with Katie, boy, talk about a podcast whose time has come, right?
Certainly.
It was really cool to have that conversation.
No, it was great to have that conversation. As you mentioned, maybe even 10 years ago from an employee or internal communications standpoint, and I've managed these functions and worked in these functions for large employers, it was really viewed as being, I'm just going to be frank, secondary to external communications from an executive leadership standpoint, and particularly marketing too. And it was really just around keeping folks informed. And now we've seen so much change management be incorporated in that in a complex environment where you mentioned we've got folks that are disparate, all could be remote all over the United States or the globe and asynchronous. So the interesting part about her hosting an internal podcast is that's also where we're seeing a great deal of growth in podcasting is internally because folks are trying to stay connected.
Yeah.
One of the podcasts we worked on a little bit a couple of years back was with Black and Veatch locally, which was a strategic internal podcast to try and keep, employees informed about strategy and where the organization was going to be going. So this is an extremely timely conversation with Katie, timely in the sense of it's relevant, probably, and people probably can hear this in my voice. Part of the reason this is coming to you a little bit late and I'm a little raspy is I fought COVID and I barely came out of that scrap, but recovering from COVID. So apologize and hope you guys can do with my salty voice here this episode. So,
well, we're glad you're back and get well soon, my friend, for sure. But, I'm so glad, we frankly on this kind of podcast, with our topic, we really need to do more in this internal communication space, because you're absolutely right. I mean, when I get out of school, boy, internal communications is like, that's not really where all the sexy stuff is happening. I want to go work in media relations, or I want to go work in advertising. And but in reality, what we're seeing now, and boy, you see this if you go to big conferences like IABC, is some of the most cutting edge stuff in marketing communications is happening on the internal side, not the external side. And I think it's because organizations have realized, wow, if we lose our employees, we're nothing. And in this day and age, you can lose them more quickly than ever.
Yeah, and in this world of micro ambassadors and social media, they can be your best ambassadors. And you think even about B Corps and the notion of the change of culture, and culture being so important to an organization. It's really working from the inside out to your customers, which is great. Well, what's been happening in your world? It's been a month since I've seen you, and it's like I've watched more soccer via the World Cup, or football than I've ever watched in my life while I was recovering from COVID. So that's about all I've been up to. That and year end. What have you been?
Yeah, well, if you're at work in academia like I do, I mean, this is a bit. You probably have more downtime in this time of year than any other, right? Because universities do tend to sort of close. In fact, my university's completely closed this entire week. You can't even get anybody on the phone there. So this has been kind of nice to have some time off and get a chance to plan other activities that I have going on, things like, working with you on the show and that kind of thing. So, but interspersed with watching a fair amount of football and getting excited for the next semester coming up. Going to be teaching crisis communications again. And so you and I were talking a little bit earlier, man, we've,
got a case study with Southwest and I'm a victim.
Goodness. Yes. I'm licking my chops here. People say, hey, how do you plan for your class? I said, I open the newspaper or in the old days. Right now, I flip on my screen because it's different every time. So just kind of getting ready for class and then helping a little bit, I should say, with our friends at KCIABC, which kind of segues into the next thing we wanted to talk about, which is that they're going to have for those of you locally in the Kansas City area, they're going to have their terrific KCIABC Business Communicators Summits coming up on February 23rd. It's going to be at the KU Edwards campus, and really proud of the local chapter here for that event. Has been remote for, I believe we kind of launched our show 3 years ago at BCS, and now it's coming back, because in the ensuing 2 years it was remote. Now it's going to be back in person, and they're going to have a great slate, putting it together now, a mix of local. The keynoter is going to be a guy we've talked about having on the show, a guy named Mark Schumann, who's an IABC fellow. I've heard him speak a couple times. Highly recommend that. He's definitely worth it for sure. He's going to come in to do the keynote. Had a very interesting career. I call him kind of the CEO whisperer. He worked for Southwest Airlines. He's worked for that big travel conglomerate Sabre, working directly with CEOs. So people like Herb Kelleher and folks like that. So I think Mark will be great, and it'll just be so good to have that event, because it really kind of is one of the only times a year where we get kind of everybody in marketing comms back together in one room. And so really excited about where that's going with the chapter coming up here in February.
Yeah, great speakers, a tremendous opportunity for peers to collect locally. I know we had a BCS conference last spring, but it just folks weren't just quite ready to get back. But I have a feeling here in February, folks will be ready to come back. There are going to be a number of other programming and professional development opportunities, some of them with...
Yeah, talk to me about Social Media Club, because I know that you've been doing a lot of work with them.
Yeah, so we're putting together the slate for the spring. There are a couple interesting potential guests. We're looking at having the Lawrence Police Department, someone that runs their Twitter handle.
Oh yeah, that's a famous Twitter handle.
Yeah, it's a famous Twitter handle. Come to speak to the group.
Not just locally.
Yeah, not just locally, but it's kind of like the TSA. It's kind of like the TSA Instagram account, right? It's pretty famous across the globe. We're also going to have a tech expert, and we will mention exactly who. I believe it may be Burton Kelso, that's coming to speak about online security and how to manage your digital life online in a secure manner. And so I'll mention the dates, throw those out there. There are also a number of things that I know that are going on for the solopreneurs through the freelance exchange, and number of other,
seen some of those,
number of other organizations that we'll get up in the show notes as well. So anything else you can think of?
Don't think so. I would just mention, just for listeners, stay tuned, right? Because we've got we're the calendar's turning here. So Brent and I are ginning up some some terrific things for CultivatED Marketer as we move into Q1. Really excited about an academic colleague of mine who we're going to have on, hopefully as soon as we have our interview scheduled. So that'll be coming up quick. It's Dr. Danny Legree from Kansas State University. And Danny's terrific. You and I were talking a little bit, her research is fascinating. She looks at issues of gender in marketing communications, issues of leadership in communications, fascinating topics like, why do we tend to see females really gravitate to this business? And certainly you and I see that in the classes we teach at the sort of the younger levels. But yet when we look at the leadership levels, it's still, unfortunately, mostly men. So we've not reached the kind of equity that we need to have there. And she really digs very, very deep into those topics. And so we're going to need to be on our toes and get our questions together, because she is a smart cookie, and just really excited to have her on with us coming up here in just the next couple of weeks.
Yeah. So we've got the emphasis on gender in marketing communications and communications. And then also we're looking to line up a couple guests in nonprofit.
Yes,
absolutely. As a point of discussion that I'm working on. So folks, look forward to those upcoming guests that we'll have here in the month of January as, we turn the page into a new year. But for now, enjoy part 2 with Katie Macaulay as we discuss with her employee internal communications, the changes there, and her podcast. Katie just talked about a couple concepts, connect and understand, open and honest. And we know the internal communicate because of external factors and even some byproducts of those external factors like the Great Resignation. We know internal communications has shifted and evolved in a rapid pace because of the pandemic and all these other factors you mentioned. What would you say are some of the most pressing challenges for not only internal communicators, but the organizations themselves and kind of this new, what I'm going to call kind of a new era?
Your question is very cleverly worded, actually, because the first thing I would say is make sure that your communication challenges are your organization's challenges. So I always say, you're fixing a organizational or business problem with comms. You're not just fixing a comms problem. So, there's that's actually, I think, very important. One of the first things I would say is what I'm seeing with clients every day is the sheer weight of business change and transformation. And this might be everything from, a brand new strategy, a merger, an acquisition, an IT transformation, whatever it is. But we all know that great, really successful change and transformation projects fail largely because they're not communicated in the right way. It needs a certain kind of consistent, coherent, considered communication style and lots of conversation. And that often doesn't take place, which is why those change and transformation projects don't fulfill their potential. So I think the sheer weight of that change, we've got broad shoulders, but that's been quite tough for a lot of comms people. Obviously, I'm going to have to say remote working, whatever that looks like. But I'm keen to use that word advisedly, because I think when I think about remote, I mean it in two ways. So we might be physically remote because we're lucky enough, and I do want to say that some people are lucky enough not to have to work on the shop floor, as it were. And I think we need to be mindful that there are still a lot of employees who have to go to work every day. So in some ways, I don't want to make this just a conversation thinking the whole world is now working from home or able to, because that is just not the case. But nevertheless, there are people now. We've got organizations that used to have, say, 10,000 employees across 2 or 3 sites. Now they have 10,000 employees across 10,000 sites. How do they create community and culture in that kind of organization? And then mentally remote as well, sort of psychologically remote. I've got clients that say, Katie, I'm now competing. My content is now competing with putting the washing on. Whereas I used to have those moments in the day when I was on site, when I might check the intranet or look at the business TV or open an email, and now I'll step away from my desk and do something else instead. So that, I think that's quite interesting. The other challenge, and this is happening in boardrooms, you've mentioned it already, around the world, is how do we attract and retain talent? And that's a real problem, I think. And for organizations, that's a question for them. They've got to sort of look at themselves and say, what is the experience we are offering our employees that makes them want to sign up and makes them want to stay? And I don't think since the pandemic in particular, we can be flippant or superficial about those things. So it used to be we could talk about smoothies and ping pong tables. And now we have to talk about much deeper things like, flexibility, meaningful work, self-development, offering people a genuine career path, having trusted and inspiring leaders. And above all of that, ideally an organisation that knows why it exists, what its purpose is in the world beyond making money. So that's one. And I think you mentioned the book earlier. It's a few years old, but actually it's still relevant, weirdly, in that I wrote it because I saw too many clients broadcasting messages at people. And what I thought would be more conducive would be creating environments where genuine conversation can flourish. And we all know in our personal lives that the best conversationalists are actually the best listeners. So one of the things I sort of encourage my clients to do is start with listening. Start by asking questions rather than jumping to solutions. So I think there's a lot of challenges out there, but that would be a handful.
Well, and that last piece you talked about around having open conversation, and you couple that with the remote workforce, has certainly evolved, because one of the pieces of community was always the water cooler.
Yes.
Right. If you're on site, and that's something that now is a bit disassociated.
Yes.
Because you're not having that on-site premise. The other thing you mentioned that struck me, because I've had roles in internal communication, but have transitioned to my career over time to be more of an external marketer. And one of the things you mentioned was large transformation. So I've helped large organizations through large transformation through mergers and acquisitions. And as you were talking, I was reflecting on some of those experiences and then trying to juxtapose those with some of my experiences as a marketer. And I'm wondering what kind of analytics or process has been put in place, if you know of one, that's around retention. And I'm also thinking about change curve here, right? So it's, does an associate or an employee need to be just aware? Do they need to understand? Do they need to commit? And do they need to buy in and commit, right? Each requiring a different level of action. And as a marketer, we know that in order for someone to buy, it could require 7 touches, right? In different forms along a marketing funnel. And I was wondering what, if anything, has been studied that you might be aware of that would be similar, from an internal communication standpoint around that kind of discipline to affect, in some cases, may not be change. It may just be folks need to be aware, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you mentioned the IT communication is, you just need to be aware that your systems are going to be down from 4 a.m. to 9 a.m. There's nothing we need you to do about it, right? But then other communications require a buy-in or commitment that need to affect change. And I was wondering it struck me when we were talking about that, whether that's been that kind of study done.
Yes.
Internal communication. So,
well, in some ways, I think the answer is that before any organisation embarks on any kind of communication plan, the study needs to be done internally first of themselves and their audience.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very tempting to think of the employee as one audience. It never is. And all the segmentation that applies, demographic and psychographic, is the same internally too. It's interesting you talk about, the IT outage or the change of the menu in the canteen. I always it's a little bit old fashioned for me, but I always sort of split it between need to know and nice to know. So there is need to know stuff. I need to know when my shift starts. I need to know that I can't access email from 5 o'clock today. There's need to know stuff. And what's important about the need to know is that it's clear, it's timely, and it doesn't take up too much of my time. I don't want to know about the cake sale in London if I work in Paris, for example. So please segment me properly and don't waste my time with that. Then there's this other stuff which could be described as nice to know, but you're absolutely right. It's often around the change curve, and it might be around some kind of process or behaviour change as well. So we're launching a new system, something's changing. It might be around risk and compliance, health and safety, how we approach customers is changing. And all of that, all the things you're talking about, moving people along the change curve, is relevant here. And you talk about 7 touches, and I think that's so insightful again, because what do I see so often is a chief executive stepping up to a podium with his 64 PowerPoint slides with 17 bullet points on each one, going through the rationale, stepping off the podium and wondering why people aren't changing and doing things differently. So the study becomes internally to say, if you want to affect change and influence people inside this particular organization, what does that look like? So who are the organization's influencers? How important is line managers, team leaders in this organization, thought leaders, and who are they, and who do people listen to? How am I going to get feedback to find out how this change is going to be received? And so often that comes down to how change might have been executed in the past. And is there kind of some baggage that's hanging around that we need to get rid of and own up to, first of all, before we even move forward? What language should I be using? Too often when I do focus groups, we discover that actually, people are just using very different language in the boardroom compared to on the shop floor. So you're absolutely right. It's 7 touches, it's 70 different touches. It needs to be thought through and coordinated, and it needs to be based on the uniqueness of that organization, which probably doesn't help listeners because you're thinking, oh my goodness, I wanted a template. But face to face is all I would say is face to face. We live in a highly digitized world, but face to face is still the most powerful form of communication. So that is worth bearing in mind when you consider having a potentially hybrid workforce as well.
Yeah.
I don't think we gave folks a template, but I think we gave them a fair new question to ask, right? How many touches within this organization are required, right?
Yes.
In the StratComms planning document, that's a fair new question to ask.
Absolutely. I like it.
Interesting, as Katie was talking, and I spent many years in corporate as well, but oh my gosh, how many times are we, we're herding everybody into the hotel ballroom with the melted Danish and the coffee in the back. And then, and this CEO comes up, and exactly to your point, Katie, it becomes death by PowerPoint. And I can just remember thinking, this is not really the way we should be communicating and moving people. But yet, how many times do we see that mistake made over and over again? Yeah, this is terrific. We covered so much great territory about internal communications, which we could go on probably for all day. But if you could indulge us, because we've been talking about your focus, if we could switch just a second to more of the focus that we have on our podcast, and Brent and I are both interested in, and that's younger professionals and how they ought to be thinking about their career and how they're going to develop their career. And it strikes me, internal communications is fascinating to me, and I've worked in both internal and external. But now, of course, in my role in education, I'm working with a lot of younger professionals. So, my master's degree program where the average age is probably, 27 years old, something like that. And it's been traditionally the attitude that I saw when I would talk with young professionals, or certainly people coming out of college, was, oh my gosh, internal communications, that's the boring stuff, right? I'm really just going to be communicating about change of menu and when IT goes down. No, I want to work on the cool stuff. I want to do the photo shoots and the videos, and now it's the Instagram management and, yada, yada. That's where the action is, right? And so that's that visceral common denominator reaction from that younger audience. But of course, what I knew working myself for a while in internal communications is that's not the case at all. And when I talk to a lot of them who've had those jobs, is actually they find it to be quite stimulating and interesting. And we've been talking about some of those too. Just recently, some of the strategies and the cutting edge stuff happening in our business is actually happening on the internal side. So I just love to get your opinion on that. How should we respond to these young people that come to us and say, no, that's boring. Send me over to the Instagram team. That's where I want to work menus for somebody else.
It's so funny because it's definitely how it used to be. So internal comms was the poor relation. We were the ones that always stood at the back of the room, and investor relations, marketing, PR were getting all executives' time and attention, and quite frankly, their budgets as well. And I think even before the pandemic, that was changing. And then, of course, the pandemic exacerbated change everywhere. And now we've got smart leaders that absolutely recognise that great organisations are built from the inside out. And actually, your primary audience is your employee audience. And that, in some ways, in many ways, has to kind of come first. But it's so funny. I mean, people my age talk about falling into internal comms,
Right.
almost like they weren't looking where they were going. And I fell into this role. Whereas now I'm hearing from recruiters who say, no, people are making an active choice to come into internal comms. And there's probably a few reasons for that. I mean, I think the line has blurred between internal and external. I think that's, so I do have clients who are creating content internally. 50% of it they want to be on LinkedIn or another external platform. So they understand that it's building the brand both internally and externally. And obviously we're using a greater range of media. I think the other thing is that, weirdly, because our budgets have been slender, we've had to be very creative. So it's almost like that's been the mother of invention in some ways. So we get to be quite hands and quite, I was going to say, the craft actually is quite important to us, because we can't solve the problem just by getting the big ad agency in. So I think that's quite interesting. And if you're interested in the craft, there's still quite a lot of that in internal comms as well. And then finally, I mean, what was amazing to me, and I'm sure your listeners know about the Edelman Trust Barometer. It comes out every year in January. 33,000 people interviewed in that study worldwide. And it's tracking trust against all societal institutions. So from governments, media, business in general, NGOs. And it asked this question this year about, what's the most trusted source of information? Media from my employer is most trusted. It's the media that people do not need to see as often as the others to believe it's trusted and true. Now, when I see folks at events and things like that, I say, this is your license to operate. If you're willing to be fair and open and transparent with your employees, you've got this opportunity to step forward. So I think, there's lots of reasons why I think it's sexier, if I can use that word, than it used to be. And I think there's a lot going on, and we haven't even we're only at the beginning of employee value propositions. That's going to be very interesting. So I think, yes, and purpose. I think at the moment we've got lots of purpose washing. We're going to get serious about purpose at some point. It makes this space really interesting, I think.
That's great. I'm glad you mentioned leadership commitment, because I think that's helped a lot too, right? I mean, as leaders have become more enlightened about the need and stakeholders have become more empowered, right? We talk about stakeholder empowerment all the time on the external side. It's also very true on the internal side. And I think you're good leaders and say, I know my favorite CEO, I'll just tell a quick story. My favorite CEO of all time, I was working on the internal communications team. And, we've all worked for CEOs. Some of them get communications, some of them don't, right? I tell people, if you bat 250, you get 1 out of 4, you consider yourself lucky in your career. It's probably a crass comment, but I'm getting head shaking on the other side there. So, but this guy was really forward thinking and came to us on the internal communications team. And he was a little disillusioned with how things were going with, the ever famous the annual employee survey. And he actually had a great relationship with our team. Again, I said he's a communications guy. He said, this year we're going to try something different. I'm going to have the internal communications team run the engagement survey. So I'm taking it out of his hands, and you all are going to run it. I want you to send it out. I want you to communicate the result. And I just thought, wow, because his point was, you should own employee engagement. It should not be just solely the property of HR. It should be as much, kind of like two houses of commerce, it should be as much the property of internal communications in terms of analyzing it, studying it, driving it, et cetera. And I'm just, wow, how forward thinking. And this was 20 years ago. But to your point, I think more of that realization of just the importance of communications as a powerful tool to drive engagement. We're seeing that more from leadership. It has to help at the end of the day. So my bright, shining internal communications CEO story.
Yeah, it had me chuckling as well, because we talked about, even my transition more from internal communication to more marketing focused the last several years. And I'll have clients ask me about my first influencer marketing program. And it was an internal communication stakeholder program for a manufacturing environment where we ended up identifying influential employees who were the line work, who back to the water cooler, who are the folks that people are butting up to at the water cooler. That was my first influencer marketing program.
Yes.
Internal communications activity, right? Internal communications program. So it's so apropos. And it leads us to our next question too, around those who are wanting, a productive or successful career in internal communication. What skills are you saying that are good skills as a basis for a solid career. We're talking about, as Matt's mentioned, we have a lot of younger professionals. We have folks that are in career transition as well that are thinking about getting into a role within marketing or communication profession. So what skills are you saying that are good foundational skills?
First of all, I think general business acumen. So it helps to know why, for example, turnover is vanity and profit is sanity, for example. It helps to know the implications of your organization's stock or share price, as we say in the UK, rising or falling. So general business acumen, I think, is important. And then there will be specifics about your organization and its marketplace. And that will be specific around regulation, exactly how it makes money, its competitive environment, how it measures success, and the obstacles, internal and external, to success. So there's very specifics, and I'm not sure you can learn about that any other way, but then other than actually talking to and interviewing the people that are crafting this and helping to implement the strategy. So I think that's really important. For me, and maybe it's just a passion, but it's something I think I've seen over the years just proved so useful, the ability to gather insight and conduct research. We do produce at AB some wonderful creative, but it always comes out of a really good brief. And the brief comes out of really good insight. So do you know how to collect robust data and analyze it? If you don't have data, then all you've got is an opinion. And it might be a really good opinion, but it's no more valid than anyone else's. So I would say build your credibility by knowing how to gather insight and data. And the final one, and I think it's just stood me in good stead, so I just pass it on to everyone else, is curiosity. It's genuine curiosity. And I heard Malcolm Gladwell a couple of weeks ago saying, curiosity can be a habit, not just a trait. And I thought, oh, that's very wise. That's very wise. Build it in your daily, weekly routine. I do something called a Friday update. In fact, I'll give you the link because anyone can subscribe to it. It's 5 bullet points long. It's never more than 5. And it's what I've seen each week that's interesting in the world of comms, subscriber only content. And the act of writing it means I have to go looking for that stuff. Otherwise I wouldn't. So, do read, do research, ask for recommendations. And don't be afraid, I think, also to go back to the basics. It's interesting. I've got a few books behind me, and I was looking at the shelves the other day and I was thinking, do you know what? Some of this stuff, John Cotter, Jim Collins, Amy Edmondson, it's still relevant today. So, yeah, hone your curiosity muscle, if that's a thing.
I hope our classes were listening there, because there were some big time pearls dropped, right? Business action, starting with how many times do we talk to students about that know your business before you're working in it. And by the way, when you're in internal communications, I would say I certainly felt when I was external, I could kind of fake my way through knowing the business and really, but boy, you get into the internal side, you better know the metrics and you better have a keen understanding of that. And so I think all marketers should start with business acumen, but I think on internal communications, it's even more important. And then the other thing that I loved your emphasis on was the importance of research and data there, right? I put up a quote many times on the board for students, and I think it was from the CEO of Netscape, but he had a great quote. He said, I forget his name now, but the quote was very simple, one sentence. It says, he's talking to his leadership team, and he says, if we have data, let's go with the data. If we have opinions, let's go with mine, which I felt. If you don't come with the data, then guess what? Somebody's opinion is probably what's going to be driven, and if it's the CEO, it's probably going to be his or hers. So, yeah, great thoughts along.
Why did I conjure images of Jurassic Park when they put the frog DNA in the dinosaurs, and then all the dinosaurs ate all the patrons in the park? That's the metaphor I conjured out of that, Matt, was the opinion getting inserted, and now the dinosaurs have run amok.
As I say, it reminds me of a cartoon, Matt, that I saw very early on in my career. So this would have been sort of mid to late 90s, where it's a boardroom table, all full of men, just one woman, and the chief executive saying, "That's a great idea, Miss Jones. Would one of the men here like to make it?" Thankfully, times have changed and moved on.
Thankfully times have changed. And you mentioned the Friday update, that whole notion of curiosity. That's a link we'll put in the show notes so folks can subscribe to that and continue to foster your continued curiosity as well as theirs. Katie, we've truly appreciated the time together. Is there anything else you'd like to mention that we may have missed along the way?
I don't think so. This has been such fun. Thank you so much for inviting me on your show. It's been a blast.
Well, thank you.
Well, we've truly enjoyed it. We've truly enjoyed it. Folks, make sure we're going to include a couple of the links that Katie had mentioned in the show notes, but included along with that, we'll also include a link to her book. Again, Katie's the author of From Cascade to Conversation, Unlocking the Collective Wisdom of Your Workforce. Katie, it's truly been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Katie.
If you found value in today's episode, check us out on our website, CultivatEDMarketer.com. You'll also be able to subscribe to us, rate us, and leave us a comment on your favorite podcast platform, such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher. Remember, a garden of opportunity grows with Cultivated Marketer.